Welcome to this specially convened panel on the impacts of the Ukraine crisis in Asia. The fog of war obscures not only what is actually happening on the battlefields, but also how countries across the globe are reacting. The fighting is in Europe, but the instigator, Russia, spans 11 time zones, and its policies and its willingness to use unprovoked force in pursuit of what it sees as its own security have implications for countries many thousands of miles away from the shooting. The reactions of countries around the world, and particularly in Europe and the United States, similarly have global implications. The price of oil is at its highest in about 15 years, and if an embargo on Russian oil is added to the measures already taken, the price may rise higher yet. Food prices are also likely to rise. And countries that have felt their best interests served by strategic ambiguity may increasingly feel that they need to be less subtle. And then there is the question of how Putin's autocratic gamble may embolden others with territorial disputes that they may feel are militarily soluble. All of these are areas that I expect we will touch on today, and I would like to welcome our four panelists: Nikolay Kozhanov, currently at Qatar University; Charles Sullivan from Nazarbayev University, although joining us today from the United States; Rahul Roy-Chaudhury from the International Institute for Strategic Studies; and Kerry Brown from King's College London. They will take questions at the end, so please use the Q&A button if you would like to put a question to any of them, and we will do our best to respond. I'm going to turn first to Nikolay Kozhanov, whose particular current area of expertise is energy policy in the Gulf states. And Nikolay, could I ask you please to give us a sense of the energy implications of the Ukraine crisis?
Thank you very much, Michael. Of course, it will be my great pleasure to answer your question to the extent I can do that, because currently the situation is developing in a very rapid way. We're dealing with a domino effect, and basically some of our expectations that we had yesterday might be not true and absolutely correct today. And the complexity of the situations and those obstacles that we have for predictions is largely determined by the current nature of the situation. So on the one hand, we are actually dealing not with the sanctions by now, but rather with the psychological effect from the potential use of sanctions, because the majority of Russian oil hasn't been yet directly targeted by the economic punitive measures that were adopted by the US and EU, with certain exceptions. It's more about the concerns of the consumers and producers that these sanctions may be imposed anytime soon. And from this point of view, right now, we cannot even predict what was the real amount of oil that was stranded by these sanctions. Some experts are talking only about 2 million barrels a day. The others are saying that basically almost all Russian exports, which is only, we're talking about crude, is about 5 million barrels a day, has been put on hold, which is probably not correct. But still, and second, the overall difficult situation in the market is also adding to the unpredictability of the future of oil and gas, because before the threat of sanctions emerged, we encountered quite a number of other issues in the market. And Russia, or better to say the withdrawal of Russian oil from this market, will become additional and a serious factor that might boost further the instability of prices and instability of oil supplies around the globe. Under these circumstances, the key question is what actually it means for the Gulf suppliers. And as a proof of what I've said before, that initial assessments might not be correct, is definitely the example of initial judgments that were done by quite a number of analysts that the Gulf states might profit from the current instability. To a certain extent, this assessment has its own merit. So the Gulf states definitely need high oil prices to replenish their coffers. They were largely depleted during the COVID pandemic. And they are definitely enjoying right now a huge oil bonanza that's coming at their hands. And secondly, of course, the analysts are saying that the Russian disappearance from the market will definitely open certain opportunities for them, not only in Europe, which is probably going to be the most affected area by the Russian disappearance, but also in Asia, because the Asian consumers right now are also thinking about whether they should go forward with the choice of Russian oil or not. Yet, however, behind these judgments, there are certain issues that are not making the situation that bright and that profitable for the Gulf states. First of all, the Gulf states are really concerned that high oil prices may speed up the overheating of the market and the further destabilization of it. And as a result, they'd rather prefer a stable market and stable prices rather than the skyrocketing oil prices that came up with the substantial crisis and drop down. And also, while definitely we see a lot of concerns about Russian oil, and Russian oil became toxic, but what we see right now in the market, we can assume that it's not going to disappear immediately, or at least in the volumes that are predicted by some analysts. And right now we see that the Urals, which was traditionally channeled to European market, it lost a lot in its price due to the discounts, historical and unprecedented discounts provided by the Russian government. And now it's actively channeled into Asia, where, yes, it still remains toxic for the majority of the consumers, but nevertheless, it also became very appealing for those countries who are looking for a cheap alternative of expensive oil coming from the Gulf, coming from other areas. And as a result, it increases competitiveness of the Asian market, which is traditionally considered to be the main consumer market for the Gulf players. And thus it creates actually additional risks for them. Also, we don't see the key Gulf players. First of all, I'm talking about oil producers like Saudi Arabia, like UAE, being extremely vocal about their readiness to replace Russia. And this is also explained by quite a number of interesting factors. First of all, they don't want to ruin the discipline inside of the OPEC. And at least for the last 2 years, the OPEC was trying to stick to the principle, OPEC plus, that technical political issues that emerge in the organization, and especially those technical issues that some of the members can have with their production capacities, should not be used by any other side for additional profit. I mean, any other side within the cartel. And from this point of view, of course, exploiting the Russian disappearance from the market, at least from the short run, would be a violation of this rule for Saudi Arabia, for the UAE. Second, there is also a question about whether the Gulf monarchies can replace Russia in oil market and in the gas market. Qatar was already clear that in terms of the LNG supplies, its production capacities right now does not allow it to paramountly increase production in order to satisfy possible lack of gas supplies in Europe. At maximum, what Qatar can do is increase its share in natural gas imports of Europe from 5% to 7.5%, which is, of course, incomparable with the Russian share, which is estimated in 40%. As for oil monarchies, even if oil producers of the Gulf, even if you assume that they are able and capable to reach the maximum production capacity within a short-term period, still their volume is not enough to replace Russia completely from the European market. And even the acclaimed production capacities by Saudi Arabia, for instance, they cause a lot of questions. We still don't know whether Saudi Arabia can reach its 12 million barrels a day declared production capacities or not, because some experts are saying that the real production capacities of the Saudi oil sector is just 10 million just a little bit higher than 10.5 million barrels a day. And given the current level of oil output, the potential increase is not going to be, again, helpful for the Europeans or for the global market to replace Russia. And finally, the third reason is definitely the political relations between the majority of Gulf monarchies and Russia. They are not in a hurry to take the side in the Ukrainian conflict, which is partly described by a very proactive Russian diplomacy within the last at least 5 years that we've seen in the Gulf, that created a strong bonds between Moscow and the leading Gulf monarchies. And by now, as far as I know, only Kuwait was quite vocal in this pro-Ukrainian stand. The other countries try to be at least neutral. On the other side, these stands also can be explained by certain disappointment in the United States policies. And quite a number of Gulf monarchies, at least I heard this point of view from some Qatari officials, from some Saudi officials, and also from people close to the UAE decision makers. They are not ready to stand up together with the West to support Ukraine and to create troubles in their relations with Russia, and then realize that within the next couple of years they might be abandoned or stay alone in this situation, while the West can reconsider its approaches. This, of course, assessment is, I guess, far from being correct, but still this is a kind of lesson the Gulf monarchies took from the current changes, the current transformation in the US approaches towards the Gulf that's largely considered by political elites there as a betrayal. But still, the question is whether the Gulf monarchies can replace Russia in the short run in the oil market and the gas market is probably clear. The answer is no. However, this answer will change if we take the situation in the long run. Moscow definitely, and its behavior right now will be affecting the behavior of its traditional consumers. We've already seen how in 2014, after the annexation of Crimea, the European players started gradually diversify their sources of supply. The war in Ukraine and the Russian aggression will definitely create an extra additional impulse to these changes. And from this point of view, I guess that in the long run, the Gulf monarchies can be gradually incorporated in this process. And partly the certain steps has already been done. We should keep in mind the intensification of Qatari and Saudi ties with Poland in question of ensuring Polish energy security. And also this story has been overshadowed by the Ukraine war events, but for instance, and pre-war period, but for instance, in January, Saudi Arabia signed a very important agreement with Polish oil consumers that basically grants Saudi Arabia a gradual access to Eastern European market where it can increase its presence. So from this point of view, in the long run, definitely Gulf monarchies can exploit these opportunities, but this exploitation will be shaped in the economic forms, in the forms of economic rivalry, rather than rivalry of a political nature with Russia. And that's where I would like to stop, and I'll be happy to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Nikolay. And I'll move straight on to Charles Sullivan. Charles, tell us, even though you are for the moment in the United States, how does this look to Central Asian countries?
Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you to RSAA for this wonderful invitation. As Michael just said, I'm currently in the United States, but for the past 8 years, I've called Astana or Nur-Sultan, Kazakhstan, my home. We hope to get back there soon. Over the course of 8 years, just anecdotally, I've noticed a gradual lessening of Western leverage in the Central Asian republics. a gradual increase of Chinese influence over the Central Asian republics, but really an increasing capture of the Central Asian republics' political systems by the Russian Federation. Today, it looks to me like we've experienced what I'll refer to as a type of a political Chernobyl in Central Asia. And I don't mean to make jokes or anything of that nature. I'm referring specifically to what scholarship has stated in the past about the significance of the Chernobyl accident in 1986, how it influenced Mikhail Gorbachev's thinking to restructure the political and economic system of the Soviet Union with perestroika and glasnost. So I do see that this has major potential to restructure the foreign policy dynamics of the Central Asian republics at this time. I've prepared a PowerPoint presentation I'm going to share with you all now. I'm assuming you can all see it. So what I really want to focus on today is elite calculations and how I theorize about them in the Central Asian republics. I'm obliged to say, because my employer is Nazarbayev University, that the opinions which I'm about to provide you with are mine and mine alone. They do not represent those of the Nazarbayev University. Central Asia at a glance. All of the Central Asian republics are authoritarian regimes, or non-democratic. I would say 4 out of the 5 are consolidated authoritarian regimes, meaning there's no real chance of democratization. And the one which is the exception, Kyrgyzstan, is really not going to lessen its hold on power, in my opinion, under the rule of Sadir Japarov. All of the Central Asian republics love to talk about the necessity of meaningful economic and political reform, but they don't do much. There is no desire to institutionalize political power and disperse it so that more people in the societies can partake in the exercise and contestation of power. The elites just want to continue to rule over the system. Over the course of 30 years since granting independence or acquiring it from the Soviet collapse, they've really focused the elites on trying to construct these types of systems. And they've also been focused on, for a long time now, constructing different political off-ramps for their founding fathers, so to speak, so as to have maiden political transitions. They've all completed this now, with the exception of Tajikistan, but it's going to be a dynastic transition within the foreseeable future. When it comes to criticizing Russia, the Central Asian republics don't do that out loud for obvious reasons. None have recognized the breakaway republics of Abkhazia or South Ossetia. None as well are going to recognize the DNR or the LNR at this point. The Central Asian republics, though, don't vote against Russia in the United Nations General Assembly. They abstain, or they are always absent. And that's specific because they are so much politically, militarily, and economically dependent on Russian Federation. Now, what I'm going to say today is that the guiding assumption here is that the Central Asian republics all stand to lose out significantly if the rules-based order, the so-called international rules-based order, breaks down, because they are all weak states. And the last thing they want is a revisionist hegemon sitting right on top of them. So what I'm going to argue today, as I said, this is a political Chernobyl event for the Central Asian republics, or at least some of them. It's a pivotal event, and I think it's going to significantly cause them to recalibrate some of their foreign policy agendas. Not all, but some. So they're all taking different lessons, I would say, different takeaway lessons from this event. And I think it may take some time for them to register this, but nonetheless, I think it's going to happen. The easiest one to start with is Turkmenistan. It's a highly authoritarian political system about to engage in a dynastic transition of power from Kurbanguly Berdimuhamedov to his son Serdar. The Berdimuhamedov regime is not much different than the Niyazov regime, in my opinion. Extremely brutal, extremely repressive, and designed in a way so as to prevent the exercise and contestation of political power. They hide behind a neutrality policy as well, which is recognized in 1995 in the UN General Assembly. Neutrality affords a weak state like Turkmenistan protection. No state in the international system is going to attack a neutral state. Okay, so they're going to hold very firm to this foreign policy agenda. In fact, I think Turkmenistan will soon be saying, had Ukraine declared neutrality prior to the onset of this conflict, there would have been no war. I don't think that's a good argument to make, because what Russia wants is a neutrality where you have a pro-Russian government. But nonetheless, I believe that's what the elites are going to take away from this event. Tajikistan's in a different political situation. Since the return of the Afghan Taliban in Afghanistan, The one Central Asian republic which has been very loud, vocal, and hostile towards the takeover is Emomali Rahman's regime in Dushanbe. That's because he's trying to institute a transition, dynastic political transition to his son, Rustam, who is the #2 man in the government and the mayor of Dushanbe. But Tajikistan also had a civil war from 1992 to 1997, when violent extremist organizations were operating from inside of Afghanistan, though I would say they weren't receiving much assistance, but he's clearly concerned. The amount of US assistance has significantly dropped to Tajikistan as well since the American withdrawal from Afghanistan. So he's very concerned about the onset of a new civil war potentially, or the problems in Afghanistan spilling across his border. Based upon this, what I think that Rahman is taking away from the war in Ukraine is that Russia will go to the mat for its national security interests. So in other words, he does not have to reform his political system. He can continue to engage in vulgarous acts so as to maintain political power, which he has done over the course of the past 20 years or so. And Russia is going to hold firm towards him because there is a pressing national security interest of the Russian Federation to do so. So these first two are the ones which really I don't think have to worry too much about the war in Ukraine, though Tajikistan is extremely dependent on Russia for remittances, so labor migrants. So this is the major danger, I think, facing Tajikistan going forward, is its economic situation is in trouble. But I do believe that Rahman understands that Russia will come to his defense if need be. The interesting ones are where I am in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. Kazakhstan in January 2022 experienced a failed coup attempt. There were mass protests in response to a spike in the price of gasoline. And in my professional opinion, what happened in the midst of those protests was a faction within the government that's known as the Nazarbayevtsi, which run the KNB, which is the security services, tried to hijack the protests, institute mass chaos, and then try to overthrow the sitting head of state, who's Kassym-Jomart Tokayev. Tokayev called in the CSTO with Putin to tip the balance in his favor, and they restored order very quickly. It was a very violent, vulgar display of power by the CSTO, led by the Russian Federation, but the political situation has, for the most part, stabilized up until now. This means that Tokayev's political situation is fragile. I believe that, metaphorically, the Kazakhstani state is duct taped by the Russians at this point. You still have a fracture within the government. Tokayev can only carry out a political purge to the extent where he doesn't trigger another fight. And it's because most of the Nazarbayevtsi are extremely wealthy. They control much of the economy, whereas Tokayev is a technocrat, and he was chosen as a compromise candidate in 2019 by Nursultan Nazarbayev. So the political situation is very fragile in Kazakhstan. And obviously dependent upon Russia. Kyrgyzstan has experienced multiple coups. 2005, Akayev's overthrown. 2010, Bakiyev was overthrown. 2020, Jambekov was overthrown. And a previous president, Atambayev, is in prison. So massive political instability. What Chaparov has done since coming to power is found a way so as to learn from all the mistakes of his predecessors. He has seized control of Kumtor, and he's really cozied up to Vladimir Putin. He is really the only Central Asian head of state at this point who has made certain statements in favor of the Russian Federation with respect to the war in Ukraine, to the best of my knowledge. Kyrgyzstan is a very poor country as well, again, dependent on migrant labor remittances from Russia. So these two political systems are somewhat up in the air at this point. They're very concerned about their sovereignty too. They don't like any discussion of possibly questioning it. The Russian Federation, when it went into Ukraine these past 2 weeks, sought to decapitate the Zelensky administration. There's reasons where I don't think that succeeded, but I believe it would have succeeded had they chose to go after a fellow CSTO member. I don't think they would do that, but Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan are much more vulnerable regimes. It's because Kazakhstan has a very low population density. You would just need to get 2 cities where even one of them and the other one would fall. So that'd be Nur-Sultan and Almaty. It's an authoritarian government as well, with a legitimacy problem. You have a sizable ethnic Russian population in the north, so the Russian Federation could foment or create out of thin air, conjure up a pretext to invade. The populations are both small as well. In Kyrgyzstan, there already is a large Russian military presence outside of Bishkek and Kant. And as I said, Japarov is very much tied to the Russian Federation at this point politically. Both of these countries are quite distant from the West as well. So they're vulnerable in the sense to, if they try to break free from Russia's orbit in the future, they are at risk of another coup that could be sponsored by the Russian Federation. That is a distinct possibility, in my opinion. So they have to be careful. Uzbekistan's in the best position for multiple reasons. One, it's a very consolidated authoritarian regime. Shavkat Mirziyoyev came to power in 2016 after Islam Karimov passed away. Mirziyoyev has done a very good job in terms of establishing a rebranding of Uzbekistan under a more benevolent form of authoritarian rule, so to speak. It's not nearly as brutal, repressive, and vulgar as the Karimov regime was, and it's really trying to court foreign investment. Mirziyoyev has also neutralized the security services. So as I said, with Tokayev, the coup attempt was the security services trying to overthrow him. In Uzbekistan, that cannot happen, in my opinion. Their wings have been clipped, so to speak. It is prostrate to Mirziyoyev. Mirziyoyev is very much interested in developing a variety of different economic ties. So he's engaging in multi-vectorism, which is the Nazarbayev foreign policy during the 1990s, early 2000s as well. And despite the fact that Uzbekistan does have migrant labor remittances, as well as Russia is its biggest trading partner, I would say that Uzbekistan is in the best shape to guard against major currency fluctuations because it has really prepared for something like this. It has a lot of gold reserves. It has a lot of foreign currency reserves. So it's still going to be affected. You're going to see fluctuations in all of these currencies, but I would say Uzbekistan is in the best shape. To conclude very quickly, my time's almost up. What is Russia going to do next? I don't think Russia can win this war based upon the political goal of establishing a puppet state at this point. But I do think that Russia has the ability to go back to its old playbook and basically bite off another chunk of a sovereign nation. And that, I believe, is what they're going to ultimately do. This is a prediction. Keep in mind, political science is not a hard science. It's very far from it. And many political scientists did not anticipate Russia being bogged down in a type of quagmire situation in Ukraine. But I believe that what Russia will try to do is create a breakaway state, Novorossiya. The military has done quite well in the south because of the ability to go through Crimea to capture certain cities now. And I believe they'll call for a ceasefire, possibly brokered by the United Nations. The Duma was talking about legislation with a coordinating state using the CSTO for peacekeeping missions. Russia wants foreign troops in Ukraine on its side, and Kazakhstan in particular. They asked, and Kazakhstan turned them down. So I'm sure Mr. Putin is not too happy with Mr. Tokayev about that. But what I believe is going to happen is the CSTO may well end up getting sucked into this war. They very much don't want to do that. The Central Asian republics are terrified of the sanctions. They view Russia right now, in my opinion, as radioactive, so they want to get away from it. But also what this war signifies to them is that Russia is behaving like a revisionist hegemon. In terms of IR theory, you could argue that Russia is a neo-realist power, which is trying to protect its zone of influence. But I'm speaking from what I think the Central Asian republics see. They don't see that. They see a revisionist hegemon, which is dangerous to them at this point. A radical policy would be if Kazakhstan declares neutrality like Turkmenistan to get away from the CSTO. I don't think they're at that stage yet. Tokayev is talking about neutrality with respect to this particular situation, but if it worsens, it may be worth considering for Kazakhstan. Kyrgyzstan, I don't think they'll be able to do it simply because Japarov is in Putin's back pocket. It'll be difficult for either of them to declare neutrality, though, because of what I said about the threat of a coup. One last point I'll conclude on. I think Russia's actually in danger of losing its sphere of influence at this point over Central Asia. Western influence is lessened. Chinese influence is treated as suspicious by the Central Asian republics, but now there's a genuine fear amongst the Central Asian republics towards Russia. So Russia has, its economy has been severely devastated. It's militarily been somewhat embarrassed in Ukraine. And at this point, it's politically isolated. So if the Central Asian republics, I think the elites are going to start scrambling to try to find ways to recalibrate their foreign policies, at least some of them, because they understand that they don't want to be pulled off of a cliff with Russia. Thank you.
Joel, thank you very much indeed. A very comprehensive survey there. We'll move straight on, if I may. Rahul, could you talk to us about this from a South Asian perspective, and particularly, I guess, an Indian perspective, but not only?
Thank you, Michael. Firstly, apologies. I'm doing this through my phone for reasons beyond my control. So I don't have a sort of computer in front of me, so apologies for that. But I thought what I would do is focus largely, but not solely, as you suggested, on India, and look at three aspects of this. The first would be the diplomatic aspect, and then the political impact of India and Pakistan's relations with the West, and finally, the strategic impact that the Ukraine war could have on South Asia, focusing on India and Pakistan. Let me start with the diplomatic aspect and start with India in that respect. As you know, India, as a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council, took a considered decision to abstain in the 25th February vote in the Security Council condemning Russia's aggression. India did this on the basis of its national interests, but also on the basis of what it perceives as an act of neutrality, that is abstinence in voting represented a balanced position for a country that was not willing to take sides in such a conflict. India's view is that this does not represent support of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, for which it has expressed deep concern, has sought dialogue and diplomacy, and has also criticized Russia, although obliquely, in terms of some of its statements at subsequent UN Security Council and General Assembly meetings, particularly focusing on the importance of territorial integrity and sovereignty. Having said that, I think the perception of the West is quite different from that of India in these charged political in this charged political atmosphere, and there has been a considerable amount of disappointment and some surprise, I think, in the West in terms of India's abstinence in voting in the UN Security Council. My own sense is that I'm surprised at the surprise that the West has, because the West obviously has based its perceptions on what India would be doing on very high expectations. And India has made it clear that it is walking a tightrope in terms of this vote between a long-standing strategic partner, Russia, and a recent strategic partner, the United States. But feels that especially for its strategic dependence on Russia in terms of arms that Russia has been supplying and is supplying to India, especially arms that are denied to it by the West in terms of advanced technology, that India had no other option but to abstain in the Security Council vote and also subsequent votes in the UN General Assembly, most recently on Ukraine. So I think what you have, and I'd like to sort of focus a bit more on the Western response to India's vote. What you have really is a sense where the West has been, I think, has been, as I said, disappointed. I think there is an emerging trust deficit between the West and India, because remember, the West had sort of expected that India would take a decision based on the principles that India had been espousing in terms of rules-based international order. But as the India's External Affairs Minister, Dr. Jaishankar, stated very clearly at the Munich Security Conference last month, when he was questioned over whether India's principles applied only to the Indo-Pacific region or to Europe as well. His response was that it wasn't just a matter of principles, but it was a matter of balancing principles and interests. So the Western response, I think, as I said, disappointing. But the important aspect will be, well, what will be the new normal of the relationship between the West and India? And I think in this respect, we have a recent pointer, which is the summit level virtual meeting of the Quad countries that took place after India's vote on the 25th of February, where we had the Australian Prime Minister, the US President, the Japanese Prime Minister, and the Indian Prime Minister discuss a number of issues. Interestingly, in the readout that came out from the White House, the focus of the Quad meeting was on Ukraine and Russia's aggression against Ukraine. The readout that came out from the Indian Prime Minister's office focused on the Indo-Pacific and the importance of the Indo-Pacific and agreement that the Quad countries should focus on the Indo-Pacific. So sometimes one wonders whether they were at the same meeting or not. But having said that, I think it shows that the West is still willing to work clearly, despite trust deficit that is clearly apparent, that the West is still willing to work with India on the Indo-Pacific, especially in terms of countering China. But there are 2 or 3 issues here. And before I come to those issues, just a quick note on Pakistan. Pakistan had to vote in the UN General Assembly. Pakistan, like India and China and a few other countries, abstained from that vote. And we, as you all are aware, the Pakistani Prime Minister was in Moscow on the day of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and was unfortunately filmed arriving in Moscow airport and telling his Russian interlocutor that he had come at an exciting time in terms of political developments. But Pakistan, again, similarly, in fact, the diplomatic response in Pakistan by the EU countries has been much stronger than in India. And EU ambassadors have recently issued a sort of a note to the Pakistani government questioning and actually sort of questioning its abstinence in the UN General Assembly, to which the Pakistani Foreign Ministry has retorted strongly that Pakistan is not such a country that, the EU ambassadors can dictate what they'd like for it. So both India and Pakistan, in different ways, are going to test some of the nature of the relationships with the West. Finally, the strategic impact for South Asia of the the war in Ukraine. I think, as your first speaker said, I think it's still very early to get a sort of a realistic sense of what this could mean. But just 2 or 3 quick pointers before I end. The first, from India's side, would be concerns over the continued supply of Russian arms to India. As I said earlier, that this was a primary reason, if not the single reason, for India abstaining in the UN Security Council vote against Russia on the 25th of February. But having said that, there are now questions whether Western sanctions on Russia will in various ways impact the supply of Russian arms to India. Also, whether it will impact on the relationship with the US with the supply of sophisticated air defense systems, the S-400, that Russia is passing on, has sold to India, whether the US will apply sanctions under CAATSA, which it has so far looked away from applying. So this could also come in. So the first concern would be in terms of arms supplies coming into India from both Russia and from the US. The second concern will be really in terms of the focus on China, which is India's primary concern, the primary threat. And clearly, and maybe I think India hasn't quite understood the focus that Europe is now placing on the war in Ukraine. But I think that the energy, the European energy to focus on or in support of India via China is going to be sucked out of it. And its preoccupation will be Ukraine and not in the Indo-Pacific for the next few months and possibly more. So I think there's going to be a second strategic impact that the European focus, which is moving towards the Indo-Pacific, I think has taken 2 steps back. And finally, quickly, the question on oil increase in oil prices, but also food production. And compounding this is the whole question of Russia's isolation. If Russia is to become isolated politically, as one of your speakers mentioned, then that will require a huge rethink for India's foreign and security policy in terms of being able to successfully navigate the changing contours of international and regional politics. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Rahul. And now moving swiftly on, we'll come to questions. There are a number of questions already posted, but please keep them coming. Kerry, China, there's been an awful lot of speculation, perhaps subsiding a bit now, about Taiwan. I know you're going to talk about that, but take us through how you think China is viewing all of this.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think China's position is obviously different than India's and the Central Asian states and anyone else really, because the context in which Russia's done what it's done, these sort of horrific events in Ukraine, which have led to so much human suffering and appalling consequences. I think for China, this is a sensitive moment, and I think it's broadly very, very unwelcome. It's a headache too, because of course China has invested quite a lot of effort in the relationship with Russia, and it's also probably going to be very, very wary of Russian dependence on China. I mean, I think it doesn't want that, but that may well end up completely by accident, where that may well end up what's going to happen. I'll talk about 5 things: the exposure of China, the hesitancy it's shown, the kind of Western unity that I think it's probably not sort of happy about that's happened because of the invasion, the issue of Taiwan, and then the kind of the idea of scenarios of whether it can play any more proactive role. China, just as a context, does have interest in Ukraine. I think it's its biggest. I believe it's its biggest investor. It's invested certainly a lot in energy in Ukraine. It's invested a lot in building infrastructure there, and so you kind of think that it has very specific interests, which are clearly being negatively impacted at the moment. And also, I believe the Xinjiang Construction Corporation has been doing deals with an energy company in Xinjiang, and that's a kind of totally kind of unexpected dimension. Of course, Xinjiang is a hugely important area for China, a very sensitive area, and this kind of instability and uncertainty added on top of all of the issues around Xinjiang, both internationally and the way that China is trying to manage these, are also very, very unwelcome. China has been exposed through its hesitancy to do anything beyond abstaining and just talking about generic language of peace, which is what Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, mentioned this morning at a press conference, I believe, in Beijing at the National People's Congress being held. It's kind of shown that those who are fearful of China being the great dominant global power can relax a bit now. I mean, it's just not willing to. This would probably have been a moment if it had had greater ambitions, when it would have had the grounds to speak out, and probably would have been given a more sympathetic hearing in the United States and Europe and elsewhere, and probably has the leverage over Putin and over Russia because of their very close relations. And so far, it's not really said anything at all or done anything at all, apart from saying everyone should work for peace. And, you know, kind of, this is quite exposing. I think it shows that all of this sort of narrative of China being the emerging hegemon, no, I don't see that. I think we see a country which is diplomatically terribly hesitant and just sort of wants to sit perpetually on the wall. Things may change that. That will probably be either very good or very bad. But at the moment, this is, you know, the kind of same pattern, I suppose, it's taken over most major diplomatic issues that don't directly impact on it, although this particular issue could well impact directly on it. That hesitancy, I think, is quite significant. The second is, I don't think it will be very comforted by the imposition fairly unanimously and relatively harmoniously of sanctions across Europe and America and elsewhere against Russia. I think it will not like this sudden appearance of Western unity. It has enjoyed the period of Western disunity, particularly between America and Europe, and the arguments over NATO, and the fact that there was such bad blood over the last 5 or 6 years during the Trump presidency over what countries were spending on their defense. This event between Russia and Ukraine has clearly created surprising unity, and something I think that China will ponder and think about, because it shows once more that perhaps just as the greatest mistake the West often makes, by West I mean Europe and North America and their alliances towards China, is to believe that China doesn't believe anything and just parrots its belief system. I think the greatest mistake that China makes is to do the reverse and think that the West doesn't believe anything anymore. Well, I think it's going to question that now. Clearly, there are things it does believe and is doing things about. Third, on Taiwan, there's been lots of speculation, and I'm very skeptical. Taiwan is a different situation. First of all, it would involve an amphibious landing, and that's a totally different kind of issue to the things that we're seeing, of course, in a land war. But I think one thing that China will reflect on is the extraordinary kind of resilience and powerful emotions of Ukrainians as they face this onslaught. And in Taiwan, it's dealing with 23 million people who, more and more obviously, according to surveys and how they vote, do not think they're Chinese. They may think they're Taiwanese Chinese, but they definitely have a complicated view of their identity. And the idea of imposing an enforced settlement on them through invasion, I think, has become less likely and less tenable now. I don't think it was very tenable before, but it's now really, really looking unattractive. I think that China is going to have to radically rethink how it's going to achieve this reunification it wants, but without force. I think that's pretty clear. So the parallels, I don't think, are very, in terms of military action, I don't think are very kind of helpful. But in terms of showing how force and the use of force is profoundly problematic, I think that's really underlined for China, that issue. The final thing, I suppose, is about this issue of options for China having a kind of a more positive role. It is possible, if Putin were to become increasingly irrational and to carry on threatening to use nuclear weapons and to kind of do things which were very, very unspeakable, as he's said, I think China may well be coaxed down from off the wall. And that will be a kind of interesting moment. The idea of China having a unique leverage over Russia, and I think it probably does, because of the enormous amounts of energy it takes, and the fact that with sanctions, Russia is likely to be brought much, much closer, more dependent to China. It's not completely straightforward, but it does give China increasing leverage over Moscow. And I think it is a kind of tantalizing possibility that Xi Jinping, thinking of his great moment of national renaissance and rejuvenation, being spoiled once more by what Russia is doing, may well kind of be able to use that leverage in ways that were not expected. Putin and Xi apparently have good personal rapport. This has been described not as a nation-to-nation relationship, but as a person-to-person relationship. So there are kind of possibilities, and they could be deeply disruptive, this idea of China being the great spoiler and the great status quo shatterer, because were it to play a positive and constructive role in resolving somehow this huge tragedy, well, then the West is going to have to completely rethink how it looks upon China and become much, much more complicated in its view. I don't think that looks very likely at the moment, but then I don't think many of us thought the things that we're seeing today were very likely a month ago. So it is a scenario we're going to have to think about. Just very finally, it's the 50th anniversary of the US-China rapprochement under Nixon in February 1972. It is strange and kind of a bit of history repeating itself. The United States and China, of course, the reason for their rapprochement predominantly was a triangular kind of movement against Russia, or the USSR as it existed then. And it's strange that despite talking of the complete changes in geopolitics and the fact that China and America are so dominant now, that Russia is still very, very significant. And 50 years later, those relationships, Russia, China, and the United States, are still so important. I guess what we can learn from the events 50 years ago today is that China does not have a straightforward view of Russia, have a straightforward view of the USSR. It doesn't have a straightforward view of Russia. And I think that we shouldn't make kind of assumptions about how it is going to be blindly obedient and just sort of sit where it is at the moment. It's a question of how quickly it has to do something and how dramatic that is. But its policy on Russia has always been very, very fluid and extremely kind of open and dynamic at times, as it was 50 years ago. And we might be seeing one of those paradigm shifts now. And that could change everything geopolitically. Thanks.
Thank you, Kerry. And it's sort of very useful reminder that there's behind the often sort of impenetrable facade of Chinese international relations statements, there's a lot going on. You took us just about there towards the question of whether China might be able to play some sort of role, some sort of mediation role in effect, although I don't think you used that word. And one of our questioners has raised that same question, not about China, but about Kazakhstan. He asks, what is the potential of Kazakhstan as a mediator in the Ukraine crisis, similar to the Astana process that ended the Syrian war? And Charles, could you give us a view on that?
Sure, and thank you for the question. I'd say very limited. If any of the Central Asian republics are in a position to possibly serve as a venue for peace talks, it would be Tashkent or Samarkand in Uzbekistan, because they're not members of the CSTO. I don't think Ukraine in good faith would want to sit for negotiations in Kazakhstan just because Kazakhstan is still allied to the Russian Federation through the CSTO. I'd also add that the peace talks in Astana, I wouldn't really call them peace talks. The Russian Federation pulverized parts of Syria for the explicit purpose of engaging in a type of Melian dialogue in Astana. At the time, it was Astana. And the goal was, I believe, to then go back to Geneva and say, look, we have the workings of a peace deal in place. I think Russia's abandoned that entirely with Syria. One, because the Turks and the Americans are not going to leave. And two, I think Russia realizes now that the more power Assad takes back in Syria, the less leverage Russia then will have over him. So I think Russia is very much content with Assad simply remaining in control of a portion of the country so that he's captured, he's in their back pocket. The other point I'll mention is we're not nearly at the stage where there's going to be peace talks. The Kremlin is not seriously interested in talks, in my opinion, at this point, and they won't be interested until at least I think an attempt is made to take Kiev. They haven't done that yet. If that fails, then I think they would resort back to changing the strategy and going for Novorossiya, breaking off a piece of it so as to protect Crimea. But I don't think we're anywhere near talking about peace, unfortunately. One more point, though, I do think the Russian military is quite exhausted at this point. I can't imagine, based upon the economic conditions, that they have the ability to continue to do this for months on end. I would say, I'm no military expert, but after 3 months, I can't see how the Russian war machine continues to churn this out with all of the sanctions and also the political isolation. It's truly amazing how the international community has responded to this event. Thank you.
Thanks. Just sort of coming back to India and Rahul, Ryan Weddell, and you've already touched on this in some of what you said, Rahul, but Ryan Weddell asks, how do India's votes on Ukraine impact their position in the United States' free, open Indo-Pacific policy and potentially intelligence sharing in the Quad in the long term?
Thank you, Michael. So I think this is one of the challenges that we're facing at the moment, but also it's really it's really different perspectives in terms of what India is capable or could do. I think the Indian view is fairly clear, and that is what I had mentioned, that the India's External Affairs Minister had mentioned, that it is really a question of principles as well as interests that determines India's foreign policy, not just principles alone. Now, clearly, there is going to be, there will be an impact, I think, of what I've called a trust deficit that has emerged between India and the Quad partners. We may not have seen it in the recent Quad summit, but I think in terms of going forward in the next few months, there will be 2 or 3 particular problems. One would be the ability of the Western, I think of the US particularly, to sort of work with India on some of the more challenging issues of intelligence cooperation. I don't see that happening as quickly as it could have happened. I'm not entirely sure that was actually on the cards either in a formal way between the Quad, among the Quad countries. But I think more importantly would be the question that India will be asking itself from the responses that it received from the West. And that is, if there were a similar set of circumstances with the Chinese attack on India, as we've seen 2 years ago, less than 2 years ago, what would be the European response? Having an Indian response that has been focused on an abstinence in terms of UN vote. So I think that's again an important factor for India as to what sort of reliability can it continue to hold in relation to the West, including Quad members, in the absence of India's strong support to the West during the Ukraine war.
Thank you, Rahul. Could I just stick with you for a moment? You mentioned when you were talking about the background to India's United Nations abstentions that Russia is a major arms supplier to India. Jens Midtgaard asks, can India trust Russia as a long-term arms supplier? If China gets an economic, technological and political leverage over Russia due to Russia's isolation? And how will this policy shape Indian capabilities to stand up to China in the Himalayas and in the Indo-Pacific in general?
Michael, thank you. I mean, that's a great question. In a recent blog I'd published on the IISS website, I talked about one of the contradictions of India's policy of abstinence in the UN Security Council. And the contradiction was this, that India was dependent on Russia for arms to India, but the purpose of the arms were to deter China, that had recently had a very strong joint statement with Russia. And I'm particularly struck by what Kerry mentioned in his opening remarks, that it is likely that that Russia will be more dependent on China with Western sanctions, and that China will have greater leverage in relation to Russia. Now that would be a tremendous concern for India, because talking to people in Delhi, one of the underlying factors also for the vote was to ensure that Russia was not influenced by China to stop its arms to India. But what we've seen now actually is that Russia is under tremendous pressure, which, as I mentioned in my remarks, could result in disruption of its arms to India in any case. So at the end of it, we may be in a position that a clear reason for India's vote in terms of having that influence with Russia may not be viable anymore. And India then is going to have a greater concern over China's influence over Russia in terms of disruption of supplies to India. So it's a great question.
Thank you. And if anyone would like to see Rahul's recent piece on the IISS website, I've just posted the link to it in the chat channel. Coming to sticking still with South Asia for one moment longer, if I may, Sally MacDonald asks if you could comment on two regional points. The first is what implications there could be for potential disruption of food supply to ASEAN as a result of the crisis. And secondly, Russia has been supporting the Tatmadaw, the Burmese armed forces in Myanmar. Will this diminish Russia's ability to fund them now? I guess there's a two-ended sort of question there. I mean, to what extent can Russia afford it? And secondly, would it make any difference to the military regime in Myanmar's willingness to accept it?
So Michael, I'm honestly, I don't know the answer to the first question. I haven't sort of looked at the food security dimension. So if others can respond, that would be useful. But I'm not competent enough to respond to that question. On the Tatmadaw, I think that actually, this could provide some opportunity for India. India, has an engagement with the Myanmar military government, but it's also, has raised concerns over human rights violations, but has understood again in a very similar way that it has to be pragmatic over the relationship, and that the nature of its interests with Myanmar really focus on the border areas, sometimes turbulent border areas between India and Myanmar. But I think why I say the opportunity is that actually, the Myanmaris may feel that in terms of training, etc., that they may look towards India, and possibly India could negotiate a sort of relationship that does focus on what it's also keen on bringing sort of political stability and element of democratization to Myanmar. So it could be an opportunity, but it's early days so far. Michael, you've muted yourself.
So thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much indeed, Rahul. We are slightly over time. I will take one last question because it does concern a country we haven't touched on at all. And I think Charles and possibly Kerry, this may be one for you. It's very simple. What are the implications for Mongolia? I see silence from both of our potential responders.
Mongolia falls outside of the region of Central Asia. Technically, it's a very quiet country when it comes to in terms of Russian Federation relations. So unfortunately, I cannot speak intelligently about it.
I don't know if I can speak intelligently about it, but I will try and speak. I mean, I think Mongolia has enough issues, of course, in its relationship and dependency on China. And I mean, whether this changes that or not, I mean, these are completely separate things. They pre-exist this, and they will continue long after, hopefully, this terrible situation at the moment is resolved. I mean, Mongolia's population, what is it, about 2.5, 3 million people. It's the size of about a quarter of Europe. Chinese investment, Chinese interest in raw materials, Chinese migration up to a point, though mostly people of Mongolian ethnicity from the Inner Mongolia, predominantly the Inner Mongolian area of China. These are enormous influences on Mongolia, in which it's, as a democracy, trying to at least maintain some autonomy. It is used to being the sandwich meat, as it were, between what was once the USSR and then was Russia, and that now is Russia and China. So I think it's these problems are decades old, and as I say, I don't think are going to be impacted particularly by what's happening in between Russia and Ukraine. So I think the other factors are not sort of associated with that, and you can't really kind of link them with it.
Thank you very much. And we are going to have to end there, I'm afraid. I'm sorry, there are one or two questions still outstanding that we haven't managed to reach. I apologize for that. We are out of time. If you want to revisit this this webinar, it will be on our YouTube channel within the next 24 hours, and the transcript is also going to be available within 24 hours to be downloaded from the RSAA website. On Wednesday this week, so in 2 days' time, we will have another event when Harold van der Linde will be talking to us about the economic geography of Asia as seen through its stock markets. When that was scheduled, we had not anticipated that those stock markets might be showing some impacts from the Ukraine crisis, but I dare say that that's also going to be a factor. So I hope we may see many of you again on Wednesday. In the meantime, could I just thank our four panelists, please? Nikolay, Charles, Rahul, and Kerry, thank you very much indeed for a very interesting discussion. I'm sorry we weren't able to carry on for longer. Thank you and goodbye for now.